Hello, this is Bilal. I teach ONA level economics. Today we'll be solving some MCQs for the chapter utility, including indifference curve, budget line, and the graphs for this chapter. Now, the way you're going to solve this is when you see the question, you need to pause, figure out the answer yourself, and then resume the video and see what the right answer is. Best of luck. I hope you get all of the MCQs correct. Let's get started. A utility maximizing consumer spends the whole of his disposable income on food, and it's $40, and clothing. The table shows the price of food, the quantity purchased by the consumer, the marginal utility he derives from the consumption of food. All right, so for food, the price is 5 and the marginal utility is 10. So for the fifth unit, the marginal utility is 10. So per dollar spent on food, he gets how much? 10 divided by 5, which is equal to 2. So for every $1 he spends on food, he gets 2 marginal utilities. His marginal utility from clothing is 2. What is the price of cloth per unit and the quantity purchased by the consumer? Now, it has to be equal to this. We'll use the same formula of equimarginal principle. Marginal utility of food divided by price of food is equal to marginal utility of clothes divided by price of clothes. So for food, we already did the calculation. 10 divided by 5 is equal to 2 divided by x. So what should x be? I think x should be 1. The price should be 1, right? And then the equation would be balanced. So this is the only way you're going to solve this. And we can see that this is the right answer. Now for the quantity, I'll just tell you how the quantities are being calculated. So if an MCQ comes up differently, you can solve this like this as well, right? So we're demanding 5 units of food, and food is for $5. So 5 into 5 gives me 25. So out of 40, 25 goes on the spending of food. I have remaining $15, and $15 means I can buy 15 clothes if the price of clothes is $1. Right? So that's how it was calculated. Now, I would recommend you not to solve using quantities, but to use the equimarginal principle formula, and that's a better and a correct answer for that, right? So let's move on to the second MCQ. For the purpose of measuring the income effect of a change in price of a good, what is not held constant? What is not held constant? So the real income, which means the price plus income. Both the prices are also not held constant and the income is also not held constant. So if we need to combine them, it's known as real income. If the price of the product falls, we would say that the real income has increased, right? And if the income increases, we would also say that the real income has increased. So basically, the real income would lead to a change in income effect, right? Let's move on. The diagram shows marginal utility from the consumption of quantities of X. What happens to the total utility as consumption of X rises from 1 to 6? Okay, now we can see that the marginal utility at this point is negative. which means that the total utility would fall. So the graph for total utility would increase, and then it would start falling after the fifth unit. So from 1 to 6 it would initially increase and then it would fall. So the answer is D. This is the basic graph for total utility, right? Marginal utility at every unit is positive. So this means that the total utility is increasing. On the fifth unit, it gets negative, which means now the total utility will start decreasing. Moving on. When choosing to buy two products, the satisfaction gained by the additional consumption of different combination of these two products can be represented by an indifference curve. What statement about indifference curve diagram is correct? So basically, indifference curve definition or indifference curve can be defined as a curve that shows a combination of goods that provide the same satisfaction. So basically, the examiner is asking for the definition. So the definition is the range of indifference curve shows the combination of product a consumer can purchase with given income. No, at this point it's incorrect, because indifference curve does not talk about incomes but rather talks about satisfaction. An indifference curve is a downward sloping straight line. No, it's not a straight line. It is convex to the origin and the shape is something like this, right? Indifference curve never cross. Yes, because this means that the consumer would be indifferent between the combination of two goods. Yes, and even when one combination provides more of each goods. All right, so this is basically the characteristics of indifference curve. Two indifference curves can never intersect. Higher indifference curve provides a greater satisfaction. Indifference curves are downward sloping, not necessarily straight lines, right? So that is why it's correct. They will never cross, because if they cross, what would happen? I'll just show you. So let's say they're crossing at this point. There are two indifference curves. This would mean that the consumer would be indifferent between the combination. So if there is an indifference curve and this provides 100 satisfaction and this also provides 100 satisfaction, because the number of units for both the goods at point X are the same. We understand this. Now, if I move on to this point, I'm consuming more on the above line and I'm consuming less on the below line, but still the satisfaction would be the same. That's not possible, right? If I'm consuming more, I should have more satisfaction. But because indifference curve tell us that the entire curve would have the same satisfaction, so when we move down or when we move up, the total satisfaction would remain the same. So when two indifference curves intersect, which is not possible. Why? Because when they intersect, they'll have the same combination at intersection. But when they're not intersecting, they will have different combinations and still provide us the same satisfaction, even though one curve would have a greater consumption and the other curve would have a lower consumption. So a very good MCQ from learning perspective, right? And usually you get a question also on such type of scenarios where the examiner tells us to define the characteristics of indifference curve. So a very good one. The gap between indifference curve is always constant. This is also incorrect. The gap might be reducing, but it will never intersect. Okay, the diagram shows the total individual utility from consuming glasses of fruit juice. How can this information help drive the individual demand curve for fruit juice? Now, the total utility is initially increasing. At this point, it's at its maximum. Now, how can this be used to drive a demand curve? I'm just giving you an explanation. The marginal utility diminishes. This curve is for total utility. So the marginal utility is diminishing. For each additional class, I am less satisfied. So what that basically means is I'll pay less for the next class because I'm getting less satisfaction. So when the prices fall, only then would I consume the additional fresh fruit juice, right? So let's look at the options. By revealing the marginal utility, well, this is correct, because using marginal utility we can drive the demand curve. By revealing the money value of marginal utility, there is no such thing as money value of marginal utility, or the concept which it's trying to explain, per dollar value of marginal utility. And the thing that we discussed in equi-marginal principle above, no. By showing how total utility is maximized, no. Total utility is maximized at a point where marginal utility is equal to 0. So this has nothing to do with the demand curve. By showing the relationship between utility and expenditure, again, no. Let's move on. The diagram shows the total utility of consumers Y and Z. When each consumes bar of chocolate, what is the difference in marginal utility of consumers Y and Z when each consumes 4 bars of chocolate? So for Z, the marginal utility is, for the third, it was 45, and for the fourth bar, it is 40. So marginal utility is negative 5, and for Y it was initially 65 and now it is 70. So 70 minus 65 gives me a positive 5. So the difference between positive 5 and negative 5 is 10. Students confuse this MCQ by opting for 5. But we need to make sure that the signs are incorporated, right? We need to find the difference between minus 5 to 5, right? Economists normally assume that the marginal utility from consuming additional good is positive and diminishing. Okay, so what does this statement mean? This means that when we are consuming a product, the marginal utility is falling, but it's never negative, it's just positive. What is the effect on total satisfaction of consuming extra units of the good? Marginal utility, if it's positive, the total utility will be increasing by a slower rate, but it would be increasing. The total satisfaction would rise. So C or D, by a slower rate. So that means by a decreasing rate, right? Let's move on to the next one. What does the marginal utility diagram show? Okay, whenever the marginal utility is 0, the total utility is maximized. That's the rule, right? The total utility is maximized at X. No, it's maximized at Y. The total utility becomes negative if the quantity consumed increases from Y to Z. No, it does not become negative, it decreases, right? The total utility decreases if the quantity consumed increases from X to Y. No, the total utility would increase. The total utility decreases if the quantity consumed increases from Y to Z. Yes, this is right. The total utility will decrease, right? So that's the concept. The graph would look something like this for total utility. It would increase up till this point and then it would decrease. So it's not going negative, it's just decreasing. The diagram shows individual demand curve, individual indifference curve for apples and pears. So it's an indifference curve. At point X and point Y, we'll get the same satisfaction because we are indifferent. What can be concluded from the movement from point X to point Y on this curve? X to Y. So we're moving like this. The individual can afford more. No, affordability is not included in indifference curves. The individual has not changed their total utility. Yes, the total utility remains the same. The individual prefers apples to pears. No. Right? So it cannot be stated because we do not have the utility per apple or per pear. The individual has gained more utility. No. Why? Because it's on the same indifference curve. Total utility would remain the same. What does a budget line show? A budget line basically shows us the goods, the combination of goods we can purchase with the given income. The maximum combination of two products that a consumer can buy with a given level of income or a budget, right? So that's a definition. There's no explanation to it. It's just pure definition. Oh, okay. The budget line BB, right? So it's this one. Show the combination of two goods X and Y that a consumer can obtain with a fixed income of $60 per week when the price is $1 for Y and $2 for X. If the price of X rises to 3, what will be the new budget line? Now, how do we make the budget lines? It's like this. Oops. Okay. Just give me a second. So how do we make it? What values would come over here and over here? So let's say Y is 1. So the total budget divided by the price of Y gives me 60. So it's going to be 60 over here. And for X, 60 divided by the price of X, which is 3. This gives me 20. So it's going to be 20 over here. So which curve has 60 and 20? It's B2. So B to B2, that would be the right answer. Right? So that's how you calculate your values on the budget line. 12. The diagram shows two indifference curve and two budget lines. For X and Y, the consumer's initial equilibrium is at R. Okay, so this is the initial equilibrium. There is a shift in the budget line from YX to YX2. Okay, so it's a shift outwards and it's a parallel shift. Whenever there's a parallel shift, this means that the incomes have increased, or it also means that the prices have decreased, but by the same proportion for good Y and good X. All right, usually when there's a parallel shift, the incomes have changed, right? So what can be definitely concluded about X? Okay. It is a given good, it is an inferior, it is a normal, it is a public good. Well, it is an inferior good because initially we were consuming, let's say, 10 units of X. Now we are consuming, let's say, 9 units of X. When the incomes have increased and the demand has decreased, this is inferior good, right? This is basic concepts. The diagram shows two indifference curve and two budget lines for X and Y. The initial position is at F. The consumer's preferred final position becomes H. What is the movement from F to G? Now, F to G is substitution effect, right? So whenever there's a pivotal shift, right? Whenever there's a pivotal shift, which means one axis is fixed and the other axis has changed. It's a pivotal shift. So the initial equilibrium, when it moves on the same indifference curve, that is your substitution effect. So this is my substitution effect towards G, and towards from G towards H is my income effect, right? Substitution effect for a fall. Now this we know is a substitution effect, but has the price of X decreased or increased? We are buying more of X, which means that the prices have decreased, right? So C is the right answer. The last MCQ, the diagram shows consumers' indifference curve and budget line for electronic goods and foods. Okay, if the income and prices remain the same, at which point on the diagram will the consumer maximize the satisfaction? Simple. We need to consider the consumer equilibrium, which is where budget line and indifference curves are tangent. So at A, it's intersecting. At D, it is intersecting. Hence, it cannot be the answer. At C, it's not touching the budget line, which means it's beyond our budget. B is the right answer because it is tangent to the budget line. I hope you got most of the MCQs correct. Best of luck for your tests, your examinations. Goodbye and have a good day.